Hello, everyone. Ricky Dragona here, World's Strongest Author. Today, I promised you that I would read you one of my stories. Again, Steve Costello does a spectacular job in narrating the stories. So, Steve, hopefully I don't butcher your narration of my stories. The story I want to read is one that I think is very pertinent right now. There's a lot of sentiments out there. About some people and how we treat them and the importance of some of our members of society right now. So this is a story actually I wrote a few years back. It's called Tears in the Pacific. So hopefully it makes you think. Thank you. Tears in the Pacific. In the distance, the door crashed open and everyone's ears in the common room perked up. Nobody should have been outside, but yet the door had just slammed open. As we exchanged perplexed looks, the howling and desperate cries began to echo through the old hallways. The screams were filled with pain and agony of the dying beast. My imagination started to envision some monstrosity that had crawled out from the sea, but my stomach and the horrible feeling within it quickly brought me back to reality. Like I said, I'm not a narrator. I looked around and the sick feeling intensified deep in my gut. The sudden urge to vomit overtook me as cold sweat started to bead on my forehead. My head kept spastically turning, trying to find Lawrence, but he was nowhere to be found. The screams intensified as they reverberated through the edifice and the dying soul approached us. I dropped the plastic cup of water I was holding and started to run in the direction of these screams. With every agonizing step, the voice behind the lamented cries became clearer, and my panic increased. I negotiated with every deity, promised my soul to every demon, and hoped my ears were deceiving me. I moved as fast as my whole body would propel me, following the sorrow-filled cries. The figure finally came into view as I turned one last corner, and it was slowly dragging itself down the hallway. Each of his movements obviously sent intolerable waves of pain through his body. Behind the broken soul on the ground, the door on the outside was still open. The harmless-looking but deadly rays of the sun shone in the darkened hallway. No one should have been outside. No one. My run had slowed into deliberate walk, and I both wanted to run towards the body and still not face the reality that awaited me. The figure looked up, and the grunt and cry reached an intense crescendo. I heard and said the expression my heart sunk a million times, but had never truly felt it. It took all my might not to fall on my knees in despair as I reached the body, my Lawrence. No one should have been outside. Adrenaline kicked in and I went into emergency mode. I carefully rolled him onto his back and his one handsome face grimaced in pure agony. He tried to speak, but I just hushed him and tried to comfort him. The whole left side of his face was almost melted off his skull. Muscles, ligaments, and melted skin hung from him, ruining what once was a beautiful face. His blue eyes rotated in his socket, desperate, looking for an eyelid that didn't exist anymore. The melted, destroyed skin stretched down most of the left half of his body. I held his right hand and his desperate eyes fixated on me. Tears ran down his face and whimpered escaped from deep in his chest. My heart truly fell, and there was nothing I could do for him. Others soon made their way down the hallway. They could not hide the repulsed and horrified looks from their face. Martha made her way through the mass of gawkers and took over. Martha was the closest thing we had to a doctor. As soon as I saw her, I gave in to the catatonic state I had been fighting. I could hear the screams as they took Lawrence away. I felt his hand slowly slip out of mine. As I remained there kneeling, tears streaming down my face. He was all I had. He was all I had left. No one should have been outside. The pain and hurt became too overwhelming, and soon my brain turned into anger. The hot feeling exploded from the pit of my stomach and flowed through my veins like lava. My jaw and fist clenched, and without knowing it, I was storming down the hallway once more. This time, I had a destination and a target. Omar. I don't know if I kicked, punched, or pushed the door to his office, but I almost recoiled back. But it almost recoiled back and hit me from the force. The old man sat behind his humble desk, his eyes wide open from the surprise. I wanted to say a million things at once, but my clenched jaw and an overwhelmed brain would only allow me a few words. Again, I'm not a narrator. See why I pay Steve for this stuff? He's awesome. This is your fault. My voice was filled with so much pain that my ears almost didn't recognize it. The blind rage grew to protect me as I flipped the old man's military desk with a flick of my arms. The old man quickly rolled back on his chair, getting himself out of the way of the flying desk, and sat there bewildered. I stormed out of the small office and headed toward the infirmary. I could soon see the blocky red cross painted outside the room. The agonizing screams coming through the door assured me my Lawrence was in there. I focused on the red cross. Its paint was old, but still looked red and proud. I made it to the door, but could not bear to go inside. Instead, I kept on walking all the way to the end of the hall and back. I don't know for how long I did that, minutes or hours, but it wasn't until my boy's sobs stopped that I was able to even look inside the room. I stood just at the door and looked in. Martha was still working on him, applying creams and bandages to the melted skin. Most of the medicines were plants from the island, but at least the old military base had an insane amount of bandages and gauze and other medical supplies. Bandages, gauze, and other medical supplies. Lawrence laid on the bed. He must have finally passed out from the shock. I didn't know if it was a good thing or not, but at least I knew he wasn't in pain. He shouldn't have been outside. Martha must have felt my gaze on her. She turned and gave me tired but kind eyes. She stepped away from Lawrence and came to the door and came to meet me at the door. I couldn't look her in the eyes. If I did, I would break down. Instead, I kept looking over her shoulder at Lawrence. He looked like a half-unwrapped Christmas present, his whole left side covered with white, wet bandages. It must have been how the pharaohs looked during mummification. Martha placed her left hand on my right shoulder, and I could not help but look at her. He's a strong boy, James, but he's in rough shape. I have cleaned him up the best I can. Now all we can do is wait and allow his body to heal. He shouldn't have been outside. The words have been reverberating in my brain for the past hour, and it was the only thing I could say. Martha hugged me. I know. No one should have been. He's a strong boy. He will heal. Just give it time, James. You shouldn't have been outside. Martha held me and I wept. I wept every tear I had left, each one of them coming straight out of my soul. When I was empty and my eyes burned, Martha tried to walk me to my room, but I refused. There was no way I was leaving Lawrence. She found me a comfy chair, and I sat there looking at the still perfect right side of my boy. My vision became blurry, and I joined him in rest. I woke up the next morning to an achy back and the sad reality that it hadn't all been a dream. Lawrence was still in the infirmary bed, just how I left him. I felt my weathered joints and found my way to my feet. I could see his chest rising and falling with each breath, so I dared and ventured out of the room. The moment I entered the hallway, I could hear hushed voices talking somewhere near. I followed the murmur to find Martha and Omar talking with concerned looks in their eyes. I walked up to them as they now stood in silence. Their eyes followed my every movement with great concern. I walked right up to them, purposely invading their personal space. I stared into Omar's eyes and into his soul. He shouldn't have been out there. Omar broke my gaze, his shame-filled eyes staring down at his feet. I had known Omar since we got to this island 45 years ago. I was 7 at the time and he was a young man. We were 2 of the original 53 and now 2 of the 23 left from the crash landing. My mom, my dad, and I were flying back from Hawaii to our home in California after a family vacation. The plane was full of mostly tired, tan, and sunburned tourists, making their way back to the mainland after a tropical escapade. My dad slept on the aisle seat, and my mom kept me busy with toys and videos. I remember every little detail as it had happened yesterday. The plane started to shake. At first, it was amusing to me, but the terrified eyes of the adults told me it wasn't normal. The shaking stopped, and the plane started to freefall. I remember the seatbelt being the only thing holding me from floating away at the strange sensation in my head and stomach. We fell for what felt like an eternity as the pilot got the plane under control, the weightless feeling turned into gravity trying to squish me into the chair. I felt as if I had an invisible elephant. I felt as if an invisible elephant had been sitting on me. We stopped moving with a jolt and the distinct sound of splashing water. The pretty stewardess guided us out of our seats into a large yellow slide. I glided down the fun slide and into an equally bright yellow inflatable boat. I remember as we floated away from the plane that the back half of it was nowhere to be seen. The remaining front half quickly sank into the dark blue Pacific, leaving behind an effervescent mass of bubbles. The adults tried hard to guide the boat with the paddles, but the currents eventually won. As they always do. We rode the sea currents for days until we landed on a small island. Another of the bright yellow boats landed on the same island and 3 others in the larger island right across from us. The adults tried to remain calm, but the panic was transparent in their eyes. I can't remember how long we stayed in the little island, but help never came. Provisions quickly ran out. Being a kid, I never missed my ration, but I could see my mom and dad were barely eating or drinking. There was no water on the island, and people quickly started to fall ill, including my mom. It only took 4 days for the fever to take her. She was one of many who were buried in the tiny island before we made our treacherous trek to the slightly larger island. I hung onto the raft, watching all the adults paddle as if our life depended on it. Looking back on it now, they probably did. Omar was in the yellow raft with us. He and my father paddled as I hung on, looking back at the island where my mom's body rested. Tears ran down my face under the hot tropical sun, their salt joining the big blue Pacific. I remember the total jubilation as we made it to shore. We were received by the other survivors, and the joy only grew as they gave everyone the good news. The island had a hospital left by the military from World War II, and more importantly, a well. The week passed and it became certain we were not going to be rescued. It would take a few years, but with housing, water, and the ocean full of food, we integrated back into the land. The original 53 let go of their past and embraced their new life. We had no choice but to live. To me, it felt like an eternal vacation. No more school, just life and the beach. I did wish my mom had been there with us. I would sit on the beach and look back on the small island and talk to her. There was not a day I didn't miss her. Life doesn't stop, and the will to survive is too deeply ingrained into our genes. The 53 quickly became 54, 55, 56, and more. Omar, my father, and 3 others headed the council who ruled the island. I was 21 when my father passed, and the astounding loneliness was almost too much for me to handle. Omar took me under his wing, and if it hadn't been for his counsel and attention, I would have walked myself into the waves. A few years later, I met Hope. She was the original islander, the first baby born, and resident number 54. Between her and Omar, I allowed myself to be happy once more. Hope and I fell madly in love. I felt alive for so many years of feeling, I felt alive after so many years of feeling half dead. A few years later, we were married in a beautiful sunset ceremony. 9 months later, Lawrence was born. I was 27, I had a beautiful wife, a precious baby boy, and lived in a paradise. The world had forgotten about us, but Mother Nature hadn't. Then, it all fell apart once more. Hope had complications from the birth, and 2 days after giving me the greatest joy of my life, she died. As I mourned her on the beach, staring onto the dark blue sea, it was when the skies turned dark. There was no way of knowing what had caused it, but clouds of gray covered the sky. It rained ash, storms raged, and the sun disappeared for 12 years. I wanted to quit, give up, but I had my little Lawrence. His big blue eyes, just like his mother's, gave me all the strength I could ever need. I raised a boy in an ever-changing world. The tropical paradise I had known disappeared and was replaced by a tumultuous and volatile environment. The ocean began to freeze and thaw, And once the sun finally came back, it was no longer our friend. The first few celebratory souls met the same fate Lawrence had, burned alive. None of them survived. I hope my Lawrence would. The days were ruled by the oppressing and deadly sun during the summer. The summer nights haunted by hurricanes, strength storms. After the volatile summer, there would be 3 or 4 weeks of ocean harvest. Then the once tropical waters would begin to freeze. Winter was brutally cold. The old thermometer in the military hospital will not read how cold it got. But all we could do was hunker down and try to survive like bees in a hive. Once the big blue thawed, we would get 3 or 4 more weeks to harvest, and the torturous summer would chase us back inside. Lawrence had grown to be one of the best swimmers and fishermen. He was truly one with the sea. Where bigger, stronger men had drowned, he would navigate the waters like a fish and bring back food for the colony. Unfortunately, food had started to run low, and it wasn't enough to get us through the season. Rationing started. Omar was now the only elder left, and he made sure everybody got their share. The problem was that the shares were not enough. We improvised, found new things to eat, but eventually, human ingenuity was trumped by an angry Mother Nature. We had barely survived, and the fish were hard to come by anymore. The fertile spring season was coming to an end, and there was not enough food to keep us through the tumultuous summer. Panic found its way into the conversation, and a new possible leader arose. Capena was a young man and son of Yuki, one of the originals. He was a quiet kid from what I remember, a hard worker but never much for leadership. Now Capena was the main opponent of Omar and his rationing policies. Omar didn't have to say it, but he looked down on his feet in shame. I knew why Lawrence had been out there in the burning sun. We needed more food to make it through the summer, and Lawrence was our best fisherman. I just never thought Omar would risk my boy's life for more fish. Look at me, Omar. He slowly raised his gaze, and his tear-filled eyes met mine. He shouldn't have been out there. Nobody should have. The first tears escaped his eye. I turned around and walked away before he could see my pain instead of my rage. I checked on Lawrence once more and left him to rest as I searched for Capena. I found him in his quarters, reading one of the outdated books from the old military library. We need to change things. Capena smiled at my words, leaving his book and standing to properly greet me. We hugged and offered kind and reassuring words. We hugged and he offered kind and reassuring words about Lawrence. We sat and talked. I had heard about Capena's ideas and proposed policies, but wanted to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. He was almost 40 and spoke with great wisdom. As he explained, it was clear we would not survive on the dwindling resources of the island. Our original 53 were now 97 and always growing. I guess when stuck on an island, sex happens a lot. His ideas were quite controversial, but seeing the sacrifices we were having to do, I had to agree with him. There was a small island across the way. Yes, the trip would be dangerous, but the island had its own resources. Why starve ourselves when we could send some of the residents across the channel to harvest the resources over there? The main opposition was coming from the ones that had actually been on the other island. There was no shelter or water from what anyone could remember. However, the island was never properly searched, and our only hope was to find resources elsewhere. The small island was our only other option. I have been skeptical of his idea, but seeing Lawrence have melted and probably on his deathbed, I knew Capena was right. Omar had to stop finding the reality we were living. The island was no longer the fertile paradise we had grown in, and it would never be that again. Yes, the one sent over might not make it, and that was a horrible thought, but we thought we would not make it on the big island when it all started. With my support, Capena will be able to convince enough of the residents to take control away from Omar. We barely survived the winter. We were not going to survive the summer unless more boys were sent out to get burned like Lawrence, or drowned in the nightly hurricanes. The madness and denial of the truth of our situation had to stop. Over the summer months, Omar kept sending boys out to face their death in search of food every night. A couple joined Lawrence in the infirmary, but thankfully none died. Capenna and I continued our efforts to sway the popular vote to the colonization of the small island. I kept busy visiting as many people as I could on a daily basis. Every moment of my life was either spent next to Lawrence or fighting for our cause. The visit with Lawrence were heart-wrenching. As Martha explained, he had fallen into a coma from his injuries. I would talk, read, sing, tell him about what Capenna and I were doing. I pretty much had moved into the infirmary with him. I would watch him sleep and hope Mother Earth would spare my boy of an early death. Martha would routinely change his bandages until the day came that they were no longer needed. His skin had healed as much as it would. The burns had become random mounds of hard flesh. The scars stretched from the top of his now half bald head all the way down to his knee. His left eye was covered with a patch, being that there was no eyelid to protect it. He was still my Lawrence, my beautiful boy, but I knew he would never be the same if he ever woke up. He shouldn't have been outside. Every second with him gave me the fuel to keep on the good fight for Capenna. Unfortunately, the fight took longer than I would have ever expected. The fall harvest season was quickly approaching. We increased our colony meetings to daily. In every single one of them, the tension increased. The harsh reality we were facing was slowly becoming more and more evident to everyone. The number of supporters for Capenna increased slowly but steadily. We were 2 or so weeks away from the full harvest season when the vote finally swayed our way. For the sake of diplomacy, Omar remained in power, but Capenna would execute and be in charge of the relocation. That night, as I was telling Lawrence of the great news, I felt his hand tighten around mine for the first time. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but slowly his right eye began to blink and his gorgeous blue eye looked deep into mine. He looked lost and confused, but obviously recognized me. Tears streamed down my face as I hugged and kissed him repeatedly. I held his face between mine, welcomed him back. My shouts of jubilation soon summoned Martha to the room. Once I was done smothering him, I allowed her space to check him out. Everything checked out fine, and after a few drinks of water, he was finally able to speak. I could see the pain and regret in his eyes as he stared deep into my soul. I hushed him before he could apologize. Shh, it's not your fault, my boy. They shouldn't have never sent you outside. His body had healed, but as he looked at himself in the mirror, I knew the road to recovery had just started. The small hand mirror flew off his hand and across the room. As the glass shattered on the wall, I knew something inside of him had broken as well. I comforted him, but I couldn't heal him, just help him grow and to accept it. The pain in his eyes ignited the last bit of fire I needed to finish the relocation process. After a bleak summer, I lost 10 pounds and was forever tired. But now I had all the energy I needed. We had figured much of the details of the relocation. We would double our efforts over the first 2 weeks of full harvest so that we could send the chosen ones across with a decent amount of provisions. The crossing will take a few hours, but once they were over there, they would have 2 to 4 weeks to find shelter and continue their hunting and gathering of provisions for the winter freeze. The hazards involved with the trip and relocation have people incredibly and rightfully concerned. It was going to be an extremely challenging situation, but it had to be done. The choosing of how many and who was going to be selected became the next big point of contention. Many unfair methods were proposed, but Capenna decided the only fair way would be to make it random. It was hard to argue against the random choosing, so everyone eventually fearfully accepted. The number was decided. It would be 27, bringing down the colony number in the Big Island to 70, running the numbers the Big Island could sustain about 75 individuals. We just had to hope the small island could sustain the 27 chosen ones. By the time full harvest had arrived, Lawrence was learning how to walk all over again. I would take him on walks down the hallways, and He was visited by everyone in the colony, everyone except Omar. The harvest started and everyone worked harder than I'd seen in years. Even though we were tired and malnourished, we wanted to give the 27 a fighting chance once it went over. No one knew who would be going over, so everyone wanted to make sure as many provisions could be sent in case they were chosen. Over the next 2 weeks, Lawrence became more and more himself. The colony banded together like when we had first arrived. The night before the choosing, tensions were running high everywhere. The nervous energy suffocated the hallways as it oozed out from all the citizens preparing in their quarters. I want to see Lawrence once my duties have ended, just to find his room empty. Martha caught me on my way out with a smile. "Where is he?" I asked her, my voice filled with panic. "He's fine. He's starting to come to terms with it. He went outside for a walk." Martha told me as she held my shoulders in reassurance. The words brought tears of joy to my eyes. My boy was going to be okay. I slept better than I had slept in months that night. Lawrence and I back in the regular quarters. The next morning, everyone made their way to the common room, and I must have been the only one with a smile on my face. Capenna stood in the front of the whole group with a single piece of paper and soberly started to read out names. Sobs and curses emanated from the trembling mass as the chosen learned their fate. I felt for them. I knew it would be hard, but I had faith they would make it. Omar's name was called, and I was ashamed at the Omar's name was called, and I am ashamed at the little bit of satisfaction I got from it. He didn't say a word. The old Egyptian man accepted his faith with the same grace he had led the colony. James Santiago, Lawrence Santiago. As I heard the name, it didn't seem real. I had to still be dreaming, but I soon realized I was not. Every eye in the room had turned to me in as much disbelief as I was feeling. The meeting soon adjourned and everyone disappeared under a veil of sobs to pack and to say their final goodbyes. I stood there petrified, glaring at Capenna. I don't know how, but all of a sudden I was standing in front of him, screaming, pleading, questioning how it was possible that Lawrence and I would be sent over. If Lawrence hadn't been there to hold me back, I would have probably choked the life out of Capenna. Once I was done venting all the venom I could his way, he looked at me straight in the eye and said, "You best go pack, old man." He turned and left me there to lay in the bed I had made. The next few hours were a blur, and before I knew it, we were once more boarding the big yellow rafts that had once brought us to the island. A sea of memory flashed through my heart as the familiar rubber smell overtook me. I looked across the channel and could not help to think of my mom. Sorry. We pushed off the shore and started to paddle frantically, as I had watched my dad do so many years ago. The currents were strong, and if we didn't want to get dragged out to sea, we better put every ounce of effort we could into it. I looked around the provisions-filled boat and I finally started to see the faces coming along with me for the voyage. Lawrence, brave and strong as always, did his best to paddle, but his body was not what it once was. The gray manes and bowling heads finally came to focus. I looked over the other raft just to see the same field of dandelion heads. The panting of the man next to me snapped me out of my surreal observation. I looked at him, his brown, wrinkled skin frantically paddling under the cover of the gray clouds. The dark blue, almost black sea ominously sprawled in front of us. I had seen the same scared look so many years ago. Omar rode next to me as he had next to my father. Both of us paddling for our survival. I looked back at my son as he struggled to row and my heart broke. It was obvious there was no randomness to these choices. The old, the weak, and the sick have been selected and sacrificed as lambs. This was not a chance for all of us to survive, but a purge to save the colony. Tears ran down my face once more, joining the big, dark blue Pacific. I rowed with all my might, trying to reach an island which had only one destiny for all of us, a destiny that I had caused. I cried and I rowed, the salty spray mixing with my tears, and my salty tears mixing with the ocean. I cried and I rowed, for I knew my Lawrence and I would soon meet the same fate as my mother. I cried and I rowed, as I kept telling myself, we shouldn't be out here. The end. Thank you.